Hello to everyone. I must thank Dr. Manohar and the Manohar Media team, Principal Andalkar sir, Dr. Bhatambrekar sir, and my dear viewers. Before I begin to talk on my own observations about the text that I translated from Marathi to English and vice versa, I would like to say a few things about the translation in particular. For instance, we talk about translations, too much translations these days. In fact, in the last 2 decades, there has been a plethora of translations across the globe, and even in India we have too much translations. Now the question that I would like to raise here, that why are we translating so much text, and what are its implications? Is translation a very important activity? If translation is a repetition of what the source text says, then why do we say so once again in the form of translation? According to me, translations are very important because they provide a vital link enabling different cultures to interact. Probably the most comprehensive data for studying the cultural interactions are the translated texts themselves. The best criticism comes through translation. This is what I believe. Otherwise, it would remain confined within the boundaries of a native language or the source text language, if it is not exposed through translation to a larger audience. A critic, for example, of a Shakespearean play can focus on the play by Shakespeare and address it to the readers of the source language. A critic can focus never fully to the other cultures, the other readers, the other target languages. This is done only by a translator. I would say that this is the privilege of the translator alone. The critic can make foreign work function in the mind of his readers, but the translator can make it function in his native language, in his literature, and in his culture. The foreign work can come to life in a different culture through translation only. Its cultural, social, and political reference is important when these texts address to a wider readership. The classic example of our own country is Rabindranath Tagore, the Nobel Prize winner writer, the only writer. Tagore self-translated his book, Gitanjali, and while he translated it, he made extensive modifications in his English translations of the Bangla texts in order to make them intelligent to the Western readers. He eschewed the incomprehensible native items to a larger extent. The strategy that he followed in his translation was to make the foreign reader, the Western reader, the English reader particularly, friendly. Tagore's works thus became very much popular, and his works were applauded in the West, and we know its consequences, which figured in the Nobel Prize in 1913. Without good translations, works from the past are dead. And I remember here Walter Benjamin. He talks about the concept of afterlife. What does he mean by afterlife? Translation is afterlife. It means that translation can give a state of continued life to the dead text. And the implication is that an unfamiliar text finds a new life in a different cultural scenario. Through translations, contemporary works are introduced to a wider audience. Good translations have the power to bring the past back to life and to integrate them with the present. Therefore, universals of translation and linguistic multicultural phenomena are the challenges and opportunities in today's speech communities of a globalized and globalizing culture. And it is here that translation plays a very, very important role. Today we find that we are living in a prolific growth of globalized state of cultures, and the globalization has accelerated the speed of interferences of language at large in international world. Until today, the languages such as Spanish, Russian, and Chinese were beyond the reach of Indians. Nevertheless, today the growing need is felt among the Indians to learn them. We know that English came to us through colonialism. It has now a history of more than 300 years. The contact with the English language is growing since then, and it is now beyond our control. The contacts of English in India have overwhelming implications in the translation business between the English and Indian languages. Though some would turn their noses contemptuously against the growing use of English, we need to accept the bitter truth that we cannot survive today without English, because like Sanskrit in the past, in the ancient India, English has become a language of research, a language of knowledge, a language of a link language, and so on and so forth. We also have known the fact that Marathi, and along with Marathi, the other Indian languages, nurtured and developed during the last 300 years in the shadow of English. The growth of Marathi prose and narratives or novel is particularly the overwhelming influence of the English writings. The impact that the English exerted on the Indian languages has been appallingly immense. Bhalchandra Nemade and Anand Patil have recorded its impact in their respective influence studies. The influence of the English on Marathi is observed not only in terms of lexis, but also in terms of syntax. The impact is still found in one or the other form in our day-to-day life. Today, urban centers and even towns are fairly westernized, and we have accepted innumerable things from the West. The pressures of globalization are beyond our control, and we are often entangled ourselves in questions of language. Linguists, thinkers, reformers, culture critics have been worrying about the future of Indian languages. Considering the influence of English upon the Indian languages, we fail to overcome its impact on our cultural psyche. For instance, we fail to erase the English words like railway, table, cup, mug, station, cycle, radio, TV, and many more words in the contemporary Marathi language. The word kettle, which is distorted in Marathi as kitli, is actually a derivation of kettle. Even the word station is used by the non-literate people across the interior parts of Maharashtra as Thesan. Station distorted in the form of the Marathi word Thesan. Now, Thesan is actually the distorted form of and a derivative form of the original English word station. Now, we must accept all these derivational effects on the Indian languages. Now, in order to erase these influences of English language on the Indian languages or Marathi in particular, there are several official efforts done by the purists, and they found Sanskrit substitutes for such words, but they did not succeed. And the Marathi speech community did not use these words, nor have they been accepted by them. We do not use the artificially formed word duchaki, for instance, for two-wheelers, or char-chaki for motor car. We normally prefer to use either two-wheeler, motorbike, scooter or bike, or car or gadi. Besides, innumerable distorted forms of English words also remained in the Marathi language. We use their dialectical versions. They are very popular among even the illiterate masses. As one example I gave just now, that of Thesan and Kitli, or another example can also be given, Batli for bottle, or Tumbrel for tumbrel, and so on and so forth. This has been a natural phenomenon in a history of languages, which is known as hybridization. It also happened in our Marathi language as well as in even other languages. In the beginning of the 19th century, Marathi was under the impact of the Romantic and Victorian English texts, and we find the impact continued during the 20th century. In the 20th century, the phenomenon of hybridization is remarkable. No need to get scared. It is a process of transformation and developmental stage in the history of a language. It happens and it has happened to every language of the globe. Some people, especially the purists, worry about the future of Marathi language and predict the death of the language. Nothing of that sort will happen because a language dies when its last user dies. That is what David Crystal has said somewhere. Even this has happened with French and the English people. And so it's not a matter of worry, and Marathi will never die, and it will continue to live. If people are talking about the death of Marathi and they are producing the ambience of fear and some kind of terror, it is actually the real politic using language for attaining the political aims. Considering the impact of the English language on the Indian languages, one can argue that the seeds of translating business thus were sown in the colonial acculturation of the Indians. We felt its need in varied fields of knowledge. Today, academia, journalism, advertisement, administration, science, technology, and literature are largely dependent on English. The place of translation in literary studies and criticism is unprecedented. We attempt translation of Marathi texts into English on a massive scale, but the vice versa journey has a weaker history. This may be because of, we need a good number of competent translators translating the Marathi text into English. However, the Marathi, the English texts have been largely translated into English, into Marathi, you see, because there's no dearth of such bilingual translators. The translation studies, has been growing rapidly in the last several decades. It is now interfacing with a vast breadth of knowledge. It has become a significant instrument of international communication in all branches of human experience. Translation can refer to several things. In the first place, it can refer to the subject field, then it can refer to the product, that is the translated text, and we also can think of translation in terms of the translation process, that is the act of producing the translation. Translation in this view is a contextual thing. It is a cross-cultural communication or an expressive act. It attempts to transfer the exact contextual and several aspects of the source text and its meaning. Roman Jakobson's concept of interlingual translation is deemed as translation proper. Translation between written languages remains today the core of translation research. During the recent years, research has been undertaken into all types of linguistic, cultural, and ideological phenomena. Today, there are rapid developments and research into audio-visual translation, encompassing sign languages and interlingual subtleties. Approaches developed during the last few decades towards the discipline are outstanding. With the rapid growth of the discipline, and worldwide translation training programs, diverse forms of translation research has been crossing traditional academic disciplines like linguistics, literary criticism, philosophy, and anthropology. The translation theory has revealed an expanded range of fields and approaches, new trends, particular traditions, disciplines, or conceptual discourses began to take roots since 1960s onwards. If we ask a question, what is translation? We can say that it is a process of transferring a spoken or written text from source language to target language. A single or host of translators can hold such a task. Further, a translator conducts such a task in a specific socio-cultural context. We call such a resulted text translation. It could be a spoken or written product, or it operates in the specific social cultural context of the target language. Besides, such a text or translated product embraces the cognitive, linguistic, cultural, and ideological ambience of the target language. The translation phenomenon has a huge effect on our everyday life. This can range from anything to anything. Say, for instance, today's pervasive and darkly enveloping phenomenon like COVID-19 situation in our area, state, nation, and across the globe, or a very trivial matter like a concert pamphlet lying at a restaurant table near your home in a suburb of Pune. Translation is a broad notion. There have been different views towards translation processes, its methods, and quality assessment. One may, for example, talk of translation as a process or a product and identify such subtypes as literary translation, technical translation, subtitling, and machine translation, and so on and so forth. The reference to machine translation reveals that translation is now no longer the preserve of human translators, but it can replace human intelligence. In more recent decades, translation forms such as audio-visual translation, a written product read in conjugation with an image, or the screen such as cinema, television, or a computer game, sign, music, dance, etc. This is on the increasing scale. Translation we can understand as largely a textual process. It is in real sense an activity of retextualization. It generally begins with a source text and ends with a target text. Therefore, translation variables are textual variables. The text is considered here as the primary object of the study. It seeks to identify regularities and irregularities in the results of the translation. Several factors such as diverse contents of the source text, author's intention, reader's needs and expectations, linguistic and cultural aspects of target text, principles of equivalence, fidelity to the source text, the degree of acceptability in the target language, equivalence and cultural specificity, achievement of coherence and cohesion in target text are considered. The method could initiate, therefore, at a word, phrase, or clause level in terms of linguistic analysis. It would expand, if required, into a culture study with reference to the transfer. Methods exploited by translators in varied translation situations are borrowing, literal translation, transposition, modulation, adaptation, amplification, and so on and so forth. Let me briefly give you some of the examples. I remember Maya Pandit's translation of the Dalit text by Baby Kamble. In Marathi, the title is Jina Amucha. Jina Amucha. Maya Pandit has translated the title not in the literal sense. She translates the Marathi title Jina Amcha as the prisons we broke. Now look at here. The actual words Jina Amcha do not figure in her translation. That is, the prisons we broke. So Jina Amcha is translated as the prisons we broke. Now what is the implication? Why so much huge change, as there is no correspondence between the source items and the target items? Now when we had a talk about it, and Maya has also talked about it in one of her interviews also, that Jina Amcha, this could have been, you see, our miserable life and something like that. But Maya, as a translator, thought that the theme of the autobiography, Jina Amcha, has something to do with. I was talking about the translation that Maya Pandit did of the autobiography Jina Amcha. Now, why did she translate it as the prisons we broke for Jina Amcha? One of the reasons that she says is Jina Amcha cannot be translated literally as our miserable life or something like that, as she wanted to relate the title to the suffering of the protagonist, the suffering of the woman in the autobiography, and so her translation works more. It becomes functional and carries the weight of the central theme of the text. I can give you another exactly opposite translation of such a text. There is a famous Marathi autobiography by Hansa Vadkar, and the title of the book is Sangte Aika. Now, my Jasbir Jain and Shobha Shinde translated this autobiography, and look at the title that they have proposed. It is You Ask, I Tell. It is absolutely literal translation, not even literal translation. You ask, I tell. Sangte Aika. You ask, I tell. Now this appears to be a little bit very odd sort of translation, and does not carry at all the significance of the Marathi title Sangte Aika. It could have been something like the story of my life, or listen to my story, or something of that kind. But here, exactly the literal translation has been done. So literal translation is often uh, said or often considered the worst sort of translation. The prominent poet Vinda Karandikar from Marathi has attempted his own two books, uh, uh, into English, and he was a Fulbright scholar and had some company of the renowned translator A.K. Ramanujan in Chicago when he visited it. He has been one of the greatest Marathi poets, no doubt about it. But as a translator, he has followed the strategy of literal translation. There are several poems which he translated, self-translated, where we find literal translations, strategies have been exploited by him. Now his famous poem सकाळपासून संध्याकाळपर्यंत तेच ते तेच ते, he translates these two lines, as far as I remember, as from morning to evening, from सकाळपासून संध्याकाळपर्यंत, from morning to evening, तेच ते तेच ते, the same, from morning to evening, the same. Now this is this sounds very odd in the target language, and so he would have done it differently. I myself has attempted as a minor research project on Vinda Karandikar's translation, and has produced a work of around more than 150 pages, and has extensively examined his translations. I have also a separate paper on Vinda Karandikar's translations, and I presented that in Sahitya Academy conference. The point that I'm trying to arrive at is transposition, a strategy that Roman Jakobson suggested works in such situations when the translation of the source text is rather difficult or sometimes impossible. In such situations, transposition strategy works, and we can have hundreds of examples to show that how transposition can work in place of literal translation. In several of Kolotkar's self-translations, we do find such kind of transposition practices that he himself has exploited, and he has come out with very effective sorts of results. Literal translation is usually a very dangerous sort of area, and in which many translators land in, and so we have to take a lot of care in such kind of attempts that a translator might tend to get in. Sometimes borrowings are also done, and borrowings are again the worst options when you do not have any other alternatives left out, and unless you borrow the native item, you cannot complete your translation. In such unique cases only the borrowing method can be used. I translated B. Baliza is one of the important novels by Rajan Gavas from Marathi into English. recently, and the novel is in pipeline, and it is being published very soon by Popular Prakashan. Now, in this novel, you have several types of texts. You have discursive texts, you have um, uh, texts which are non-standard. You have a cinema in this novel, and there is a lot of drama that goes on. The cinema script is actually the part of the novel. There are long letters by the protagonist to, for example, you see, um, uh, Mahatma Phule, you see, and Mahatma Phule also gives replies to the protagonist. Such kind of uh, situations have been imagined, and the kind of Marathi that is used in these letters is again the 19th century typical Marathi. Now, the question that troubled me while translating this novel was primarily about the swear words, the non-standard items that uh, usually figure in the cinema or the cinema script that goes into the novel, and it is a very large sort of kind of text. It is extensive. It goes on and on in the novel. Uh, the kind of non-standard swear words, for example, I'll give you one example. The abusing word chaila. Now this occurs frequently in this script, and as far as I remember, the abusing word chaila occurs in this novel more than 50 to 55 times, and in every context, the context of this abusing word is again variable. It is different in every situation. The implication is different. The meaning that comes up is again very different. For instance, it expresses the anger, it expresses the wrath. Sometimes it doesn't say anything, it has an empty use, meaning the word chaila is used without any meaning. Now, what is to do in such a situation? What does a translator has to do? What strategy he has to follow? Is he going to translate the word chaila as something, abusing parallel word from English, and substitute it in that place, and the same kind of abuse, all across the 52 uses, Now, I didn't find it proper to translate the same thing in 52 situations or more than that. So when you are translating a swear word, you have to look into its implication. You have to find out its proper context, to whom that swear word is addressed. Now that's very important. What is its content, whether it is wrath, or whether it is anger, or whether it is a real abuse, or whether the user has used it without any meaning, or with empty meaning, or with no meaning. Now, accordingly, you will have to find out the corresponding item or the word or the abuse from the target language. And then only your translation becomes meaningful. Translation here, I can understand as I practiced it, does not mean the substitution of the substitution for, the source items, the source words. You have to find out proper way of saying it, because finally translation should be communicative. It should mean something, because you are addressing it to a reader, you are addressing it to an audience, and you have the audience and the reader in your mind. And if your translation does not make any sense, if it is unintelligent, then the translation becomes useless. So what is needed is not the sense for sense translation methodology. You have to find out the different strategies at every time, you see, and use it properly for the sake of, you see, the effective communication that the translator is trying to achieve in the target language. I did several kind of translations from English to Marathi also. There are a few things that I did. For example, Gujarat file I did, and then I did even the biography of a very important politician of Maharashtra, Sharad Pawar. And particularly when I was translating Sharad Pawar's source book, biography by Ram Kandge, I was a little scared, because a sort of tension also held in me as I was translating the text of a very important politician. So I had to be very careful, and since the source writer was very much hard upon me to complete it as early as possible, and he was very much the publication ceremony and things like that, were coming nearer. But I told him very calmly and quietly that unless and until I am not satisfied with what I am doing, I will not hand over the final text of the translation. Now, sometimes what kind of text you are translating? If it is a poem, if it is poetry, then again the risks are more. And because poetry employs the language of fear and hope, it employs the language of metaphors, and then translating a poem, it becomes almost difficult, sometimes impossible. And that is why Roman Jacobson argued that poetry is almost untranslatable. In fact, there are untranslatable several things, not only in poetry but even in prose texts. And a translator has to find out his own way of finding equivalents, which are generally parallel in the target language. I translated one long poem. It is so long that it runs into around 100 pages of Mangesh Narayan Rao Kale's poem, see, Tritiya Purushache Agaman. And in this poem, you have pieces of each piece, running into not more than 16 to 20 lines. And these are usually, you see, they run into even rhyming sort of things. Now poetry is rhyming. It implies the sounds in a particular way, and there is the magic and the musical patterns used. And I suppose you cannot translate these things into the target text. If you are translating it particularly in a foreign language like English, now you cannot find out the sound and the rhythm and the rhyming, similar kind of parallel things in the target language, because the simple thing is that every language has its own rhythm, its own culture. Language is essentially a culture carrier. It is not just a word or a text, a spoken word or a written text. And when we talk of language, what comes to our mind is the written text. Language is primarily speech, and as Saussure has said it long back, and the writing comes later. And we usually think of translation in terms of writing only, translating a written text. Now, there are so many things that I can share with you, but as the time constraints, as well as I do not have much resources at right now at my table, and probably I may be a little less prepared. So I would present all these interesting kind of data in another lecture. I think I thank once again, Dr. Manohar and his colleagues and his team for inviting me to say something on translation. And I, being a student of translation studies, I felt that I must say something. And I'm not a well-read, or what we call is the critic of the translation studies, but whatever I knew, or whatever I have known, or whatever I'm knowing, I have a feeling that I must share these things with the audience. So thank you once again for a patient listening to all the viewers. Thank you all.